In that instant, so much happened. The life as I knew was gone. Everything changed. The loss was extraordinary. I lost a son. She lost her brother. My oldest lost a brother. I knew instinctively my marriage was done. Everything was done. So much changed. What am I going to do? Like, my child was abused.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. I'm glad you're here. You've just tuned in to one of the most important podcasts that you may ever listen to, because the purpose of this podcast is to provide a safe space for victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault to share their stories and connect with others who've been through similar experiences. However, there are other important aspects to this podcast: community, education, and support. I believe that sharing our stories is one of the most important steps to healing, and my hope is that the SAS podcast will help victims and survivors feel less alone and more empowered. And my ultimate goal is to provide all of my listeners with insights, resources, and a supportive space where empathy, compassion, and understanding thrive. My commitment is to being there for all my listeners. I'm your host, Dave Markel, coming to you from the Podvlog studio in St. George, Utah, and I'm here each week talking to victims and survivors or interviewing experts and professionals in order to not only gain insights and information to help us on our healing path, but also to provide an education on being trauma-informed, working to help bring justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. Whether you're aware of it or not, we all know someone whose life has been impacted by rape or sexual assault. So I encourage everyone to listen to this podcast. Whatever your experience is with rape or sexual assault, you are not alone, and we are all here for each other. Thank you again for being here.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 58. In this episode, I have the privilege of hosting Ruthie Uhl as my guest. Ruthie bravely shares a story that sheds light on the devastating impacts of familial sexual assault. Her young daughter fell victim to this tragedy, with the perpetrator being her older stepbrother. The dynamics of this appalling situation, along with its subsequent fallout, shattered the foundations of their family. As you listen to Ruthie's narrative, you'll be struck by her incredible strength and fortitude in facing this harrowing experience. Her story serves as a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Furthermore, it emphasizes the importance of understanding the prevalence of such devastating situations in our society. Join me in gaining insights from Ruthie's journey, and let her compelling narrative be a call to action for increased awareness surrounding familial sexual assault. Here's Ruthie.
Ruthie Uhl, thank you for joining me. Welcome to the podcast. It's good to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and for my audience, I just want to give a little bit of background as to how Ruthie and I met and communicated in the first place. I saw Ruthie on Instagram. She had joined in to some of the conversations that were going on Thrivivors through the Jan Broberg Foundation. And then we just kind of started communicating because I had done a couple of episodes with Thrivivors, did some workshops with them. But Ruthie informed me that she had a very interesting situation with her home life, in the sense that while she wasn't directly the victim of sexual assault or rape, someone in her family was, and that she felt like it was important to talk about. So, Ruthie, I'm just going to turn it over to you and let you explain to us what you're able to tell us about the situation.
Okay. This is about my daughter, about my child. My child was the victim of sexual abuse by her half brother for 2 years from the ages of 5 to 7. So she was very young, and it was, of course, very, very awful. As a mom to a young child, finding this out, it brings about very, I think, unique and different challenges, because Of course, my daughter was the one that experienced the abuse and the assault, and she's the victim. My whole family, in a sense, was also a victim. And me, as the main caregiver and the one that walked through this journey with her, I experienced things in a much different manner. And during the younger years, it felt like I was also very much a victim. And as she got older and started experiencing the trauma herself, I saw how things changed and how she experienced the brunt and the brutality and the horrific nature of what happened to her herself. I'm going to go back and start from the beginning and tell our story. I was married and I had one child. My husband at that time also had a child. So we became a blended family. His son was 5 when we got together. And shortly after we got married, we had our daughter. So we had 3 children, one each, and then one together. And our kids got along as they were growing up. I didn't consider my stepson a step. I just called him my son. I mean, that's just kind of how I did things. These were all my kids. He lived with us half the time. So he was always there. You know, he had the same as all the children. And they were just siblings. They got along well. Like, looking from the outside, you would think this is great. This blended family, they all get along well. And,
Yeah.
you know, and my stepson and my youngest were close and it was great. They were 7 years apart. And, you know, from all accounts, we thought it was fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
And then like things just changed one night. Well, one night that I actually noticed there was like some commotion going on and screaming and hollering upstairs. And my youngest came running downstairs and said, "He won't let me leave the room. And he's being mean and he hurt me." And I was like, what do you mean? And she meant like he physically hurt her. I think he held her arm, or I think it was like he held her arm and wouldn't let her leave. And I was like, well, what was happening? And she didn't say much. And then I questioned him and I was like, what's going on? And nobody really said anything. It was just the weirdest conversation. I was like, you can't hurt your sister. You guys stay away from each other. Like, no more playing. You guys can't play. If you guys can't play nice, just don't play.
Yeah.
Stay away from each other.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, I have to figure this out. Something funny's going on. So I talked to a friend and I was like, yeah, the kids are being weird. I don't know what's happening. He hurt her and wouldn't let her leave the room. And my friend asked me, like, are you sure there's nothing else going on? And I was like, what do you mean? And she's like, are you sure there's nothing else going on besides that? And then it just got me thinking. And then I ruminated on it all night and I couldn't sleep, and I just kind of had this pit in my stomach, and I knew deep down something was wrong. I knew before I went to bed that I was going to wake up and ask my daughter in the morning if there was something going on, if she was being abused, and if he was touching her, what was happening. I was going to ask her the question that no parent really wants to ask their child.
Yeah.
So I woke up in the morning, and first thing I did call my daughter, and I went to the bathroom and I sat on the edge of the bathtub and I was eye level with her and I asked her, and I don't remember the words, but I asked her and she said yes. And I just remember like feeling like the floor fell out from underneath me and like this atomic bomb went off. It's the only words I can use to describe it, because in that instant so much happened. The life as I knew was gone. Everything changed. The loss was extraordinary. I lost a son. She lost her brother. My oldest lost a brother. I knew instinctively my marriage was done. Everything was done. So much changed. What am I going to do? Like, my child was abused. So all these things are going through my mind in a second.
Yeah.
And I knew the life I had was gone and it was going to have to be rebuilt. So all this was happening. I started screaming and crying. And my 7-year-old is looking at me like, what's happening? Because she had no clue. She's 7.
Yeah.
She has no clue. I'm screaming. I'm trying to think of how old I think my oldest was 17 at the time, came running downstairs. I told them what happened. I made calls, called CPS. I also called the police. I was like, this happened. I need help. So went through the whole gamut. We ended up filing charges. Well, actually, the state or whoever filed charges.
Mm-hmm.
My stepson never set foot back into our house. There was no way. That was obviously very hard to navigate because my husband was not even home when I found out. So I had to call him at work. It was just this big, huge thing to try to explain and navigate through. And I had a 7-year-old who did not even understand the concept that she was hurt. So then we had to start this legal process, which in itself is awful. So the trauma of the legal process really fell on me because my child knew nothing of what was going on of the legal process. In fact, she just really found out and heard the story of the legal process
You mean just
within the
recently?
last year.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She didn't know. She was 7. I'm not going to tell her. She just didn't need to know those details. What I found out, my stepson was arrested. He was charged. He was released from juvenile hall right away. I think he only stayed the night. From the CPS interview that was done, it was determined that he could have been charged with multiple felonies, not just misdemeanors. It was multiple felonies, and the abuse had been going on for at least 2 years. And this was based on the timeline gathered from that forensic interview that was done with the CPS investigator that they used for the court. Some of it's still very confusing to me, and some of it's very blurry because during that time, I'm still in a state of trauma and shock.
Sure.
This was from the ages of 5 to 7. My child was 5. So from kindergarten until barely the start of 2nd grade. 5 to 7, she was a baby. Just itty bitty. He was from the ages 12 to 14. Very much of the age that he knew better. I can look back now and see how he groomed her. I can see it all. I can see every last bit of it. I did not see it in the moment because I only saw him in my eyes as my child. And I've had to do a lot of my own work of coming to terms of how I missed it in my own house. And the only thing I can come up with is when you don't see someone as an outsider and you just see them as your child, you miss things. You don't see that. Someone else might have seen it if they were in our house long enough, but I didn't.
Yeah.
But, after hearing my child talk about it a lot and kind of putting pieces together, I just realized, oh my gosh, how much he groomed her and the things he told her behind closed doors, the physical abuse, the threats. She said he would choke her and pin her up against the wall and threaten her and hold her by the arms and make a lot of threats and manipulate her. A little 5 and 6-year-old child. So it was really hard for me to hear a lot of this when I did hear it because she didn't know better, but just the grooming. And then he would also in turn play with her, spend time with her, shower her with attention, take the time to play games with her, play Legos with her, do the things she wanted to do. He won her trust.
Mm-hmm.
Grooming is a very twisted thing. I would have never thought that a child could do that, but they can. During this forensic interview, we found out all the things that happened and that he could be charged with multiple felonies. We go to the district attorney, sit there, and the district attorney's like, okay, this is what we're looking at. We want to charge him with felonies. I said, fine, you charge him with what he did. This is the consequences for his actions. This is what you need to charge him with.
Right.
Well, they said that if we move forward with charging with felonies, my 7-year-old child would have to testify and get on the stand. And I said, no. I said, there's no way you're putting my child on the stand. You have her testimony. You recorded her. You have the information. He pled guilty. Like, why? They said, that's the law. I said, but she's 7. So I refused. I said, there's no way. So because of that, they had to charge him with misdemeanors, even though he committed felonies.
Mm-hmm.
I did not realize the gravity of the drop in that in terms of the consequences he would get, the difference between the felonies versus misdemeanors.
Right.
So ultimately, he was sentenced to intense sexual therapy, which he ultimately completed in a year, and then his record was expunged. That was it.
He didn't have to register as a sex offender then?
Nope, nothing, which was hard. I showed up to every court hearing. I spoke at every hearing. And I understand now it's because of the law and because it was misdemeanors and because of the way it was filed. So at the very last hearing for his expungement, I went again, spoke to the judge and said, his record should be expunged when my child's trauma is expunged. This is not fair that he gets a clean record and my child has to deal with this for the rest of their life. What I realized in that moment, because then the judge addressed him and said, because the judges changed during it, like this was a different judge than the judge that sentenced him, and said, I read your file. Do you realize you could have been charged with multiple felonies? You were ultimately only charged with misdemeanors. I'm not sure why. But because of that, there are certain laws I have to follow, which means I have to expunge your record. There was no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Basically, because he was a minor, it was a misdemeanor. He completed what he had to do. He had to expunge it. There was no other options. There was no other routes,
Yeah.
which I didn't realize that. And because he wasn't charged with a felony, he wasn't required to register as a sex offender, which I had asked the judge about that during the process. And the judge basically kind of told me that you can't request that because it doesn't fit the defines of the law, which I didn't understand at the time.
Mm-hmm.
It's because it wasn't a felony. He got his record expunged. It was done. The restraining order that was there went away because it was criminal. So I turned around and filed a civil restraining order. So there's a restraining order in place. And again, this is all done and taken care of by the time my child's 8. And my child at that point had been in play therapy, started to understand a lot more about safe and unsafe touch and safe people, unsafe people, really started understanding that what their brother did was not okay. Started grasping that their brother's out of their life. They had gone to equine therapy for probably a year and a half. So they did what they could at the age of 7 and 8. I knew this was not over for them. I knew at that point, but there was only so much they could do at that point because they were young. And during this time, I went to everything with them. I went to all their therapy, went to all the court hearings. My husband or my ex-husband pretty much emotionally abandoned us because the trauma he experienced from it, because this was his son and his daughter, he just checked out. He just completely checked out. He did not walk through any of the legal process with us, nothing. He wasn't there for any of it, didn't experience any of it, didn't go to therapy. That all just kind of fell on me. All of that I had to take in and manage too. That's where when I say the parents are the victim and I feel a piece of that victimhood from it, it's because I am. I had to deal with it. A 7 and 8-year-old cannot do it. I'm the one that walked through it with them. But I never want to take away this from my child because they experienced it. They experienced the abuse and they are the victim of sexual abuse and they are a survivor.
Yeah.
I never want to take that away from them, ever, ever, ever. But I also want to acknowledge what it's like as a parent to walk through this with a young child, because I think sometimes parents don't acknowledge the experience for themselves and own that because it's very, very hard. Very hard. It's taken a lot of years and a lot of work. Closing up that therapy was just the tip of the iceberg. So fast forward to the age of 11, moving to a different state, new start. My husband and I did get divorced, did some therapy on my own. I was doing okay, but there comes puberty coming along.
Yeah.
Puberty, the ever knocking memories that my child had, created a perfect storm of utter chaos. My child began to spiral. It started slowly, and then it just completely went out of control. It was like my child was kidnapped from themselves, and the anxiety went from very slight to so out of control. They did not know how to contain the chaos that they were feeling because they were battling all the memories. It was like they were reliving everything. They didn't even know how to communicate it to me. They started self-harming. They were completely in crisis mode all the time. So the start of 7th grade, when they turned 12, so 11, it was slight. By the time they turned 12, it started going down. August, September, right? When they started 7th grade, it was like shit hit the fan, excuse my language.
No, it's fine.
But it was complete and utter chaos crisis mode. I was like, what is happening? I didn't put 2 and 2 together. It took a little bit to figure out what was going on. Between September and December, we were probably in the emergency room at least 4 to 5 times, had called 911 at least 5 to 6 times. They self-harmed. Numerous crisis workers in the house. They started to get intense therapy. We had a WISE team, which is like a wraparound intensive services. They started to talk about suicide. By January, they had made their first suicide attempt. They had already had 3 short-term inpatient psychiatric stays. By February, it was even worse. By March, they'd had 2 more suicide attempts. I couldn't keep them in school. They kept running away from school. I had outsourced every resource I could They had a 4-person team, which involved a therapist, a peer, like a youth peer, some other person, a skills person, and then the supervisor. They were in our house all the time because we needed them all the time. 911 was being called all the time. I was in the emergency room with my child all the time. I was running out of options. I couldn't function. We were both at a level of, I don't know how to even explain it.
Yeah.
I was in crisis because I couldn't manage my child.
Right.
And with talking to the therapist in this time, we were realizing, oh my gosh, this is their trauma. This is from the abuse.
Uh-huh.
Oh boy, buckle up. That's what this is. It got to the point where I either found a placement for my child or I was going to literally have to call CPS and say, I can't keep my child safe. You need to come get them. And for a mom to get to that point,
Mm-hmm.
I was in the gutter because I was doing everything possible. I had locks on my house. I did everything I could, and I couldn't keep my kids safe. I was terrified they were going to kill themselves. Their support team was terrified. They were advocating to hospitals. I mean, everybody was like, this kid is going to kill themselves. We need help. So,
Ruthie, this is just devastating to you, I'm
so
sure.
devastating.
And it sounds like it came on relatively quick. Before it started in that September, they were doing fairly well, from what I understand.
Kind of, yes. So I saw these little symptoms of what I thought, what mimicked ADHD, but I was like, my kid doesn't really have ADHD. But what it was anxiety was peaking up. They were losing their ability to concentrate, to focus, little things. And I just started watching them and I was like, what is happening?
Which is
And that
really
was
very interesting to me, because I'm sure from the moment you found out about this, which was a devastating moment in and of itself, you've described what you were doing for them in terms of what a mom would do. I mean, you were focused on their needs.
everything. I ignored myself, especially, I mean, the minute we found out, I quit my job that day. I was like, I can't come back to work. We literally moved out of our house and into my mom's because I'm like, I can't work. I have to stay with this child. She couldn't go to school. I devoted myself to my child for months and months and months. That's what I did because that's what she needed.
While at the same time, you were also dealing with your own internal feelings of devastation and life changes that were overwhelming, I'm sure. Not only interruptive to your job, which you said you had to quit, but I'm sure that this also impacted your entire mindset, even sleep patterns, eating care patterns
Everything.
for them.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It changed who I was. It altered the whole course of my life. It altered my worldview. It changed me. Something like that. If it happens, it's going to change you. It can't not change you.
Exactly.
And so, yeah, I was so immersed into that. And I always knew in the back of my head, okay, this is going to come back up. There's no way that a 7 and 8-year-old is going to resolve this.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't know what that was going to look like. I didn't know how it was going to peak up. So these little bits of anxiety, I was like, okay, maybe I should get her back into therapy. She had gone to visit her dad when she was 12, that March, right when she turned 12. And I think too, also, there was some triggers that happened in that household. Not that her brother was there, but there were things that started reminding her of things. So I think that prompted a whole bunch of memories. Couple that with puberty. And I think that started the cycle of all of it coming back.
Exactly.
It was the trigger that did it. So that's where that downward spiral, because that from March to September, it was like a 5 to 6 month where it just all of a sudden started crashing. It wasn't very long. And it was like a perfect storm of my child was in literal utter chaos. And she ended up getting diagnosed with complex PTSD, which makes sense. That's what she has.
Right.
But it's interesting because complex PTSD can mimic and manifest in ways where people might be like, oh, she's bipolar, or she's this, or she's that. I'm very grateful that where she ended up, the clinician there was able to really look and be like, no, this child has severe trauma. This is complex PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
So we were able to find her a placement actually in Utah, and she was at a facility there for 14 months, a residential facility. It was the hardest decision I've ever had to make, to get my child in a car, drive her 1,400 miles away from home,
Yeah.
and leave her with strangers. But I had to save her life. That was all that was important to me, was that she lives. And I thought, she doesn't want to come home because it's too much. If she just goes to another facility, as long as she's alive, to me, that was the bare minimum. That was all that mattered at that point.
Yeah.
And then you start getting hope. It was a long process. It was a long, long process. She suffered greatly there. It was a long process for her, and she made great strides. She also had setbacks. I only saw her maybe 5 times in 14 months. We did Zoom at least once a week for family therapy, but it's not the same.
No.
I was without my child. So that was also traumatic for me and traumatic for her. And it was a lot. That was a whole experience in itself.
Well, let me interrupt then and ask Ruthie, what were you doing for yourself during that whole time? How were you able to deal with the emotional impact of all of this? And what did you do to take care of it?
Well, therapy was one. I found a good therapist, but in the midst of the chaos that was going on in the home and the constant crisis, I did have family, thankfully. So I did have people in my life. It was so much. I couldn't really care for myself in that time, to be honest with you, because there was no capacity. I had to take care of my kid. It was that level of intensity that I was barely just meeting the bare minimums for myself because that's all I could do because my kid required so much. It was a lot just to give myself the bare minimums, and I would take whatever extra I could get when I could get it. And I did start therapy in that time. So that was also good. But my kid has to be alive. As a mom, you sacrifice a whole lot. And it's also very important to me that moms take care of themselves. I'm a big advocate and proponent for that. And there's also some times where you can't because it's life or death. And that moment was a life or death for me. And there was a few weeks there where there was no time for anything for me. It was just bare minimum. It took a lot to crawl out of that for myself. When I did drive her to Utah, the first thing I did for me was I actually took an extra week off work and I took a longer road trip. I went to a family member's house and visited with her, decompressed, hiked, and just did a solo road trip back and just started to be with me again. Because I needed that. I needed to heal because what I decided and what I realized is I want her to come home, obviously. And if she comes home, I have to be in a place to meet her and accept her back in this house so we can succeed because it got ugly. I will be honest with you. It was not pretty in this household for the last 3 months that she was here. She was very, very difficult. It was constant crisis. I was in a constant state of trauma and crisis because I was in a constant state of being triggered by her.
Sure.
It was a vicious cycle. Neither of us were doing each other any good. There was no real communication. I didn't know what was going to happen while she was at the facility. I didn't know what I was going to get when she came home. I didn't know even if she was going to come home. I didn't know. And I was like, well, this is what I can do. I need to be the best mom I can for her. I need to work on me. I have to work on me. So the whole time she was there, I went to therapy. I did a lot of diving deep into myself, taking care of myself, finding me again, enjoying my freedom, to be blunt, doing what I wanted to do, taking time for myself because I needed that. I needed to find joy, rediscover things. The fall after she left, about 6 months after, all of it hit me very, very hard. And I went into a very, very scary, scary, dark, deep depression. Very scary. Like I was suicidal for a very short time to where I needed to call a friend and say, I need you to come over. And luckily I had those close friends and lifelines. I knew enough for myself because I knew where I was at, but I was in a very dangerous place. I had to go see my doctor and I needed to be put on antidepressants, which I never had to be in my life, but I needed them. All of it just came crashing and I completely just shut down. I was not okay. It was a very dark and scary time and it was valid. I mean, I had been through hell.
Yeah, for
And
sure.
it was par for the course, I would say. I went through it, I walked through it, and I came out. Antidepressants were great. I have a great therapist who was there, and I have friends who were there, and I have family. And I am very grateful for the people in my life who love me and the ones that I know I can go to.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, you had a support system on top of the therapy that you were getting then.
yeah, you always have those people in your life who aren't technically blood family, but they're your family. I had those people and I knew I had them and they were there. And that's so important when you're going through things like this. Kiddo and I just did a lot of hard work and I just didn't know how it was going to come out. It was up and down, lots of waves. And then, we were talking about kiddo coming home and they were just terrified. They're like, I'm not coming home. I'm not coming home. I'm just not doing it. And they were scared. And then it kind of turned out like we were forced to bring her home. One of their insurances was ending, the insurance that they were actually contracted this facility with. Right. So we had to. So I was like, okay, kiddo, this is the plan. We had this whole safety plan. I took my cousin with me. We flew out there, got kiddo, flew back to Portland. I drove her straight to the emergency room, walked in with her and said, I need her to put on a psych hold because I was not going to bring her home without her being cleared. I was like, I need to know she can be home. I need to know that she doesn't need a short-term stay to regroup, go back into this slowly. Kiddo talked to the psychiatrist there and we talked to some people there. And luckily this was a much better hospital than we had experience with another one here. And kiddo came home mid-June, just several months ago. And I tell you, it's like I have my child back.
Oh, wow.
Not only my child back, but it's like child 2.0. This child that I have is wiser, stronger, the most courageous, brave advocate I've ever seen in my life. This child knows what she needs, knows how to speak for themselves. They know what they've been through, and they're still not done on their journey. They still struggle daily. Mm-hmm. But they have learned how to struggle daily and experience joy. They've learned to live in the ands, and it's not just black and white. And they have made such amazing progress, and it's the most beautiful thing to see. And I just didn't know how our dynamic would be.
Sure.
It's unlike anything I could ever imagine. Our relationship is on this level that I would have never, it's more than I could have hoped for.
That's
we both
amazing.
did the work. We both strive to communicate with each other. And we both tell each other when it's wrong. And they tell me when I screw up and when they need something, and they advocate for themselves if I'm not listening to them. And it's just this thing that there's no words to really describe it. And I see them and I see this child that has scars, physical scars, all over. Yeah. Emotional scars that I see because I see them as a mom. I can see in their soul. But they have all these scars. They just walk through life now with their head up, and they started school. They've made friends. They're almost getting straight A's. They have found their place. And the kid that I had before, in that midst, that little sweet spot between when they ended therapy and all this happened, the joyous moments, I see them. Wow. My child is back. Yeah. I see the light. I didn't know if I was ever going to see the light in their eyes again.
Ruthie, can I ask, Ruthie, what did they do with the anger that was there and feeding all of this? But certainly there still must be some thoughts of anger towards that person that did this to them.
Oh, yes. That we have identified is their biggest struggle right now. Okay. When they identify the things they struggle with, it's anxiety, and they have a lot of social anxiety that's come out of this, and anger, because now they realize, they really own all this. They know what he did.
Yeah.
They know it's wrong.
Right.
They also know what the court system did. Mm-hmm. And they are angry. They're angry at the judge. They're angry at the district attorney. They don't understand the law. They don't know why he didn't go to jail. They don't understand why they didn't. They just don't understand how he could do that and just walk away. So they are angry.
And how are you both processing that?
I have processed my anger a lot. I am angry, but I'm not as actively angry because I have been able to do therapy. My child, the minute they came out of this other facility, they entered an intensive outpatient program. So they did groups and therapy. They've been in therapy since. It's a requirement of them being home. It's our agreement. So they're still in therapy. They will be in therapy probably forever. Right. But for right now, they need therapy. So that's something her and her therapist are working on. And I think for them, they're going to have to figure that out. In fact, they came to me last week and said that their therapist and them talked about the anger and trying to figure out ways to deal with it. So because they know they have anger, it's identified. And at one point I told them, I said, we should write letters to the district attorney about how angry we are. And I wrote one, and they kind of wrote one, but they were in the treatment facility then, and they weren't as engaged. Maybe at some point they might do that. I don't know. Yeah. I'm curious to see what they come up with, because they have a voice. And I think at some point they're going to use their experience and their voice to help with their anger. just so all the listeners out there know, my child knows I am doing this podcast. It is being done with absolute permission. I am not speaking anything or saying anything that they don't already know or that we have not talked about.
Okay.
So just a disclaimer, because
Yeah.
it's important to me that people know that I'm not speaking about my child without them knowing. I don't like to do that, and it's not something I practice.
Well, and I think that's fair for the audience to know, because I'm sure that's been a question in people's minds as they listen to all this, that where are they now? Are they listening to what you're saying on this podcast, or has there been some sort of prearranged agreement? And so it's good, I think, that you've pointed that out and brought that to everyone's attention. And I wouldn't have done this interview anyway had we not discussed this beforehand and made sure of all that. In fact, I'll let the audience know that there has even been some discussion that they have said that at some point they may want to be on an episode also with you.
Yes.
And while that may or may not happen, I think it says a lot to their progress and to their realization of where they are and what their own voice is, and that they do have a voice and that they can actually speak that voice in a place that is safe and protected and understood. I just think all of this is such a critical and crucial episode for my listeners who have experienced some of these same exact issues. You just don't hear about it. People don't talk about this.
Mm-mm.
I think there's an immense amount of courage and strength on your part, Ruthie, to have come on this show and shared all of what you've shared so far. And I know we've just barely touched the tip of the iceberg. I don't think there are words really to even describe the amount of torment and fear and anxiety and all of those issues that you and they have both been through. It's amazing that both of you have survived and seem to be doing really well.
It speaks to the resilience of the human spirit and body and mind. When I sit here and even just think about it now, it literally blows my mind, because I'm like, wow. But our body can heal itself and our mind can do extraordinary things. And it's not to say that she won't relapse at some point and completely have a meltdown.
Mm-hmm.
But I also know we are way better prepared for it now, because we know what we're dealing with. They're on the right medications. They have much better tools to be equipped with. They know how to identify their feelings. So we feel like we have way more tools in our tool belts to deal with the things. We're way far ahead in the process. So it would be different, but it's not to say that this at some point won't affect them again in a very deep way, and that they might not have another crisis. I'm not so ignorant to say that this will never happen again, because it could. And I know that because this type of trauma and this type of experience that my child has had lives with you forever.
Yeah. And there are multiple layers to all of this that you're describing and talking about in terms of that resilience and the healing and the length of time that that healing will take. Like you said, I think it's a lifetime thing. I think it's an issue that at some level, both you and they are going to be dealing with for the rest of your lives, but it can be still a productive, meaningful, safe life for both of you. And it sounds like you're on that path. I'm wondering, Ruthie, if you can describe for us the day-to-day experience of living with a child that's been through as much as they have, but yet seem to have really benefited from not only that time away where they were in the facility, but also since they've been home and been doing that ongoing therapy. What is the day-to-day routine like for both of you?
I mean, so it's funny because it's changed even since they came home. When they first came home, oh my goodness, it was very structured, very strict, because they came out of a residential facility. Everything was dictated to them, right? They were in this very structured environment. And I was like, I can't let them just come home to freedom. This will kill it. So it was very methodical. I was very methodical about it. And they had a lot of schoolwork to make up. So we arranged for them to do their online schoolwork left over from this place so they could catch up. So for the first 2 months, They did pretty much a year and a half of school in 2 months.
Wow.
And they did their therapy. So that's what it was like pretty much for 8 weeks. They did therapy 3 times a week for 3 hours. They did their groups and they did school in the morning. And it was very structured, very rigid. No phone. I didn't give them their phone back. So it was very structured. They started to get privileges back. They started to get little things. Then they got their phone back. Then they got certain freedoms. And then as they started to build trust, then I left them home alone for like an hour. Now they're like a teenager, a normal 14-and-a-half-year-old teenager. I leave my house. I can be gone for several hours. They're fine home alone. I take them to the bus stop. They ride the bus to school. They ride the bus home. I pick them up from the bus stop. They have friends. They have a phone. They have their friends over. They go to the library with their friends. They go to their friend's house. They're going trick-or-treating with their friend on Tuesday. And in fact, right now, my child flew last night to Denver to go see my oldest sibling for the weekend on their own.
That's amazing.
So
wow.
That's what I'm saying. It's very mind-boggling to me to be like, wow, to think about where we were. And I mean, I was walking on eggshells. I was terrified. I was like, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. And my antennas were up and I was on alert. I'm still, I guess you could say on alert, not as much on alert. And it's because my child has also done the work themselves. It's not just me. They have proved themselves. They communicate with me. They do what they need to do. They have shown that they're trustworthy and they take care of things, but they're also a teenager. They're still a 14-year-old teenager. So they're going to do teenage dumb things because they're a teenager. I want them to have that teenage experience. My saying, and we have it on a little magnetic whiteboard on the fridge, and it's a thing I've told my child over and over: live a life worth living. That's what I want for you. Have a life to live that's worth living. That's our motto.
Yeah.
I don't want you just to live. I want it to be something that's worth living. To see where they have goals. They want to work for the FBI in the behavioral analyst unit or something.
Awesome.
I see them coming from I don't want to live to I have goals. I'm going to college and I want to go do this thing.
Yeah.
And I have friends and I'm on the student council and I'm doing all these things.
That's amazing. That's so good to hear.
It blows my mind.
Yeah, for sure.
Every day.
Wow.
But it takes work. I give a lot of credit to them, and it takes work as a mom. I have done a lot of work, and I'm not trying to toot my own horn, but it's worth it because I will do anything I need to do for my child.
Absolutely.
I'm a very, very fierce mother. I will fight for my child. I will never stop fighting for my child because their life is worth it.
Ruthie, that's obvious and commendable and amazing. I cannot give you enough praise for what you've done for your child and for yourself. Tell us a little bit about where you're at. Are you back at work? Are you still in therapy? What's your life like now and what's ahead for you?
I took probably like a year off at that time, and then I went back to work, and I'm working. I have a great job. I love my job. I have great friends, family. I love where I live. I have a sweet little dog. I am most definitely in therapy. I still need that. I have a lot of things, and for a long time, my therapy was focused on me trying to deal with my child.
Yeah.
And it's slowly starting to move away to things more focused on me. Even though it was still focused on me, it was really hard to deal with my kid. So life is good. I love my life. I love where I live. I live up in the Pacific Northwest, and it's gorgeous.
Yeah.
We're thriving here, and I wouldn't want it any other way. I think one thing I want to mention, and it's nagging at me, so that's why I want to mention it, is that I think sometimes the grief about the loss doesn't get acknowledged because sometimes it can feel shameful, but there was a lot of loss. I lost a child also in this process.
Sure.
Immediately. I don't regret that at all. I chose that, and that was the right decision, but it's still a loss. And I think sometimes it's never acknowledged out loud, or there's that thought, oh, well, that's not a thing because they did something bad. It's still a thing. I do still grieve that. Even to this day, there's still things that I grieve because, like I said earlier, that was also my child. But I also absolutely did the right thing for my child,
Absolutely.
my biological child. But it is a thing. You know, there's grief, there's loss.
Sure. And that makes
it's another part of it.
That makes perfect sense. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because to ignore that is not appropriate or fair for you
Mm-mm.
or for them or for the rest of your family and your ex. I think even
Yeah.
the ripple effect of all of this has been amazingly devastating, but
Mm-hmm.
also, as you mentioned, the resilience is also pointed out that there is life after trauma. There is life after tragedy. And while you don't want to ignore that tragedy and the trauma of the grief that you've mentioned, it's always important to focus on what it is that's ahead in that healing process. I just am so impressed with everything that you're saying. There are multiple messages that listeners can get out of this entire episode, but I'd like to offer an opportunity for you. Are there some specific messages that you think need to get out there to some of the listeners?
Yes, I think something that comes to my mind is people are going to have opinions about what you do. Choose your child and fight for your child. That is the most important thing. People will always have opinions. Their opinions don't matter. Choose your child. Fighting for your child, believing your child, that is absolutely the correct thing to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think something that I learned, it's not that I think I instinctively knew this, but when my child was at their treatment facility, they were talking that as long as a child has one caregiver or parent in their life that they're attached to, that they're bonded with, they'll be okay. They need that one person.
Hmm.
So it's okay if they just have that one person. So be that one person. That's what I was for my child.
Yeah.
I had to be that. And it's not that we didn't have extended family, but I was that primary person. I had to show up for my child. So be that for your child, show up for your child, be consistent for your child. I think those are the important things. And if something feels off, it's probably off. Be your child's advocate and teach them to advocate for themselves. That's also a huge thing. They're going to get older and they need to know how to use their voice.
Such powerful stuff you just said. It actually reminds me that, yes, ultimately, the most important aspect of all of this story and the situations like this is the welfare and importance of that child and putting them
Mm-hmm.
first. Also, the message that I'm hearing reminds me of one of my favorite books written by Dr. Bruce Perry called The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. And it talks about numerous children throughout the book, cases that he intervened in and was important to bringing children back, like you've talked about. But he says that traumatized children can teach us as adults about that very thing that you were talking about loss. Traumatized children can teach us about love, and traumatized children can teach us about healing.
Mm-hmm.
And you've brought up all of that.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's so critical and important. And I'm really thankful for the attitude that you have and for the strength that you've shown in coming on this show and talking about all of this. This is difficult stuff. This is, like you said, almost life-ending stuff, and you can survive it.
Mm-hmm. You
It's,
can.
and that's why you're here. That's why I wanted you to be a part of this show. Also, though, the aspect of talking about this trauma can actually reactivate traumas. Ruthie, what will you do to take care of yourself after we get through talking this evening? And then in the next day, several days, weeks, months to come, how will you continue to deal with the reactivated traumas that may come to the surface?
It's funny you asked because I was just sitting there thinking, I'm going to put my pajamas on and I'm going to snuggle with my puppy and watch a movie. I have the house to myself because my child's off with their sibling
Right.
having fun. So to me, having a nice, quiet house and sitting here with uninterrupted time is fantastic.
Great.
Therapy continues weekly. I will always have that.
Great.
This weekend, I'll be hanging out with my friends, having a fun time. But the other thing for me that I always do is if I feel something, I allow myself to feel it. Back in the day when I didn't know what to do with those feelings, I was afraid of them and I would just stuff them away and I didn't know what to do.
Mm.
I've learned feeling things, it's not going to kill you, but I also know how to cope with them and how to handle it. So if I need to feel something, I can sit and feel it for a little bit. So if something comes up for me, I'll sit with it, and resonate with it and see if I need to do anything.
Wow.
And maybe I don't. And maybe it's just a fleeting thought. But as time goes on, it's much easier for me to talk about it. And it's much easier for me when things come up. I do become reminiscing about it, and I will start thinking about things, but the level of how it affects me just depends. I never know what to expect. I just kind of take it as it goes and not plan. And if I need a minute, I take it. I take what I need.
Such powerful advice. So good. I appreciate you sharing that. That's really important stuff.
It's important to hear what your body needs. I've learned how to take care of that for myself, because if I don't acknowledge it, it's not going to go away. It's still going to be there. It just might be shoved down for a minute.
Yeah. Ruthie, what I'd like to do is plan for the future. I see maybe another episode down the road. I'd really like to hear more about how this story progresses and how things work out for both of you.
Yeah.
But also maybe even we could delve into some of the impacts with your other children and how that's gone. We don't have time right now, but I can see that there's more that we can discuss and discover if you're willing. I would love to have you back.
Oh, I'd love that. And I know my youngest, I think they would like to share their experience. And I don't know when they'd be ready or if they'd be ready. And I don't know when they'll want to hear this podcast. I'm going to let them decide that. But I think for them, using their voice will be so powerful. Yeah. So powerful. So I would love to let them have that opportunity at some point. So I would love to continue that journey with you.
Excellent. Giving a victim survivor their voice, I think, is so critical. I've said that over and over and over again on this podcast. That's why this podcast exists, is to give victims and survivors their voice in a safe place where it's going to be honored and listened to and accepted regardless of what is said. And so it's exciting to think about that future prospect. Thank you for being so willing.
Yeah, and my kid's a survivor. I'm so grateful that they're a survivor. They are a survivor through and through.
Yeah. Well, Ruthie, thank you for being here. Thank you for an amazing opportunity to sit and talk with you like this. It's been so insightful and so helpful, and I appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thanks, Ruthie.
Okay.
Talk to you soon.
All right. Bye.
That does it for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. I want Ruthie Uhl to know how appreciative I am for her strength and bravery in sharing such a personal experience. I strongly believe that this episode is going to help others who find themselves in situations of familial sexual assault with inspiration and understanding into ways forward through this horrific circumstance. I appreciate you who've tuned in to listen to this powerful episode, and hope that you'll become a subscriber and a regular listener to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories. I'm here each week with a new episode to provide a platform for victims and survivors to tell their stories in a safe, healing environment and provide my listeners with a sense of community and shared experience. Please help this podcast grow by becoming a subscriber and by sharing these episodes with everyone you know. And please do your part to help bring justice to victims and survivors. A great way to do this is to start by believing, because we all know someone whose life has been affected by rape or sexual assault. We'll see you next week.